Hi everybody. I'm going to work today on our first video to show you how language works in a child's brain and also demonstrate the difference for a typically developing child, a child who needs interventions, and a child who does not respond to interventions. So let me see if I can pull this down so you guys can see what I have here. I have a bunch of Legos, and each of these Legos represents an animal. So when a child comes to you, and we're going to say it can be any grade level, but let's just use pre-K to begin with. Let's say they have all of these animal names in their brain. Well, a typically developing child wouldn't just know the animal names, they're going to know connections about the animals. So they're going to know, for example, a dog and a cat are both pets, and that connects them together. And they might also know, well, a fish is also a pet, but a fish also lives in the water like an octopus. And an octopus lives in the water just like a duck, but a duck doesn't live in the same water as the octopus. It lives in a pond, like a frog might live in the pond. And they can go on and they can tell you about sounds that animals make, and they can tell you about places that animals live. And they're making connections not just with a single animal, but among all the animal knowledge that they have. And every time they make these connections, their brain is growing and making more language webs within their brain. So they may be able to tell you where they go to see animals, and when they go to that place, which animals would they see. They may talk about a farm. They may talk about the zoo or the ocean or the beach. They can tell you what animals do and what animals do for us, and maybe even what we do with animals. For example, milk a cow or ride a horse. And so the typical child probably comes to kindergarten with a really solid language brain base like this. And from that base, you can build your standards. So we're going to say these fun little Lego pieces are the standards. So let's say you want them to ask and answer questions about animals. Got it, no problem. Let's say you want them to compare and contrast, and they can do that with their animal knowledge. They've got it. They can build that compare and contrast standard. Let's say you want them to describe relationships among animals. They can learn to describe relationships with this knowledge. That you want them to engage in a discussion. They could definitely do that with this knowledge. They could just engage in a discussion with their peers about animals because of all the knowledge base that they have. Maybe you want them to describe and provide details. This child could definitely do that. They have a nice, wide background language base for that. Maybe you want them to identify real life connections among all this information. That's another standard. And of course, they could do that. So this child comes to you very well prepared. They have a good base of knowledge and of language that you can use to build your standards on. Okay, let's look at another child. This is a child that comes to school at whatever grade level. And remember, I'm using animals as an example, but this goes really with any kind of concept or information. And this child comes and they do know some animal names, but that's about all. Maybe they know a dog, a horse, a cow, an elephant, octopus. They know some animals, but that's about all. They don't really have any connections. And so the teacher identifies, I'm concerned about this child. So we develop some interventions, and the teacher begins to give the child the interventions, and we're going to use these little connector blocks as the interventions. And she begins to teach the child about connections that those animals can have, about categories, the way a dog and a cat are both pets, for example. Or she might teach them that animals look different from each other and what's important about the differences in the way animals look. For example, some have 4 legs, some have 2 legs. She might also talk about the fact that some animals move in different ways. Some hop, some fly. And this child is building these connections in their brain as the teacher provides interventions. And his brain or her brain becomes much more solid and is able to use that information and place it in his brain or her brain on a solid base and build more and more connections based on what the teacher has done with interventions. So as the teacher intervenes, the child's brain begins to make more and more connections so that now they have a solid base on which you can put a standard, and the standard will stay on. Okay, if you had not provided interventions for this child and they just had random animals in their brain without the connections. So we're taking the connections away that we provided through interventions. And this is what the child comes to you with, just some names of animals. And we do not provide interventions and make those connections. And you try to put a standard on, it may connect, but it's very unstable. And it doesn't connect to anything else. So if you try to get them to describe, for example, maybe they could describe one animal, but nothing else. So it's a very loose connection, a very loose standard. So that's a child that we've provided interventions or not interventions and how it could affect their standard progression. Now I'm going to show you a different child. Take some things off here. Okay, this is a child that comes with some knowledge. But as you can see, the knowledge is a little shaky and rolly. It's not shaped quite right. And the teacher realizes something's going on. I think we need to provide interventions for this child. They don't seem to be progressing as we want them to. And so the teacher again comes in and provides the intervention and starts to help the child understand that there are connections among animals. For example, a dog and a cat are both pets. And she provides the intervention and it slides off. The connection does not stick in the child's brain. It does not bind these two things together. And maybe she tries a different tack and works on describing animals. And let's talk about an animal's body or the sounds they make. And she tries that intervention and she puts it on, but again, it slides off and it's not making the connection. So the teacher's providing the intervention, but for this child, it's not working. And so that's when your progress monitoring shows we need to do something else. And that's when we might need to do an evaluation and realize that the child does need some special interventions to help him or her learn language. And so this is probably when they would need speech and language therapy and would be eligible for speech language impaired in the special ed program. And so what we do in our program is we really break it down. We provide the information again and again and again and again until it sticks. And then sometimes we have to use special pick lots of pictures or really break down information in a much smaller way, in a much more focused way than what is possible in the curriculum in the classroom. And so we do it again and again and again until it sticks. And so we keep doing this, helping the child build their connections in their brain. Now, even though speech and language impaired can help children build their language knowledge and their concept knowledge, sometimes this still isn't quite enough. And so that's when we also bring in supports. And so sometimes your IEPs will have instructional supports or testing accommodations and things like that. And that's what this would represent, is when they're getting some special ed services, but it's still just not quite enough to fit everything on. It's not quite enough to help them. And that's when we would bring in some specialized supports like this, like instructional supports that you might see in the IEPs, and it helps the child be successful. So I hope that's helpful in understanding in a very basic way what language is in the brain and how it works for the typical child, a child that has delays but is able to respond to interventions, and a child that does not respond to interventions, and a child that receives no interventions at all. Okay, everybody. Thanks. Let me see if I can get this turned off.